Crusader Kings 3 has been out for a little while now, and the game released to critical acclaim, high praise from players, and a record-breaking concurrent player count for Paradox. It's a huge success story and something we don't get often in the strategy community, especially for sequels of beloved games. Our expectations are high. We demand hundreds of hours of replayability with deep and well thought out mechanics, modability, and maybe even some multiplayer, and they've delivered. You gotta give credit where it's due. There's other companies out there releasing sequels or spin-offs that are constantly cutting features, like modding or multiplayer, and isolating to one storefront. So credit where it's due to Paradox for this one, but this doesn't mean that the game is perfect. And in this review, I'll be discussing what works well and what they could improve in the future, and also help anyone out there still unsure whether or not that the game is for them. But before we start, this video is sponsored by Opera GX. Opera GX is a web browser made for the gaming community. It allows you to tweak your PC's performance with the built-in GX control. Here, you can decide how much of your CPU, RAM, and network Opera GX uses to make sure your games are getting the most. If you're a tab freak, and you like to have hundreds of tabs open, you can identify which ones are the most taxing and shut them down easily. The GX Corner gives you a tailored feed of gaming-related news and content, upcoming releases, updates about deals, and where you can grab games for free. You can customize this feed and also remove platforms that you're not interested in, so you always get the most relevant content. Opera GX has built-in Twitch and Discord integration. Just link your accounts and you can have quick access to those areas and never miss it when your favorite streamer goes live. This also works with other sites like Facebook Messenger, Twitter, and WhatsApp. And if you're watching something, you can pop out the video player for a picture-in-picture type experience, which is super handy if you've got limited screen space. Opera GX also supports deep customization by changing the colors and backgrounds of your browser, including support of animated backgrounds. I have a Battlefield rainy mood thing going on, and it's also got a free built-in VPN as well as an ad blocker. But of course you'd never use that on me now, would you? Make sure to download Opera GX for free and try it for yourself by using the link in the description and top comment of the video. Opera also have their own Discord with frequent game giveaways, which you can check out as well. Once again, that's Opera GX and the link is in the description. Thank you, Opera. So again, a big thank you to them for the sponsorship. As I've said, I try to find sponsors that make sense for you, and not getting CK3 early just puts me several weeks behind everyone else, so it's really helpful to allow me to still review the game and not rush things out. So it's worth noting that I didn't play Crusader Kings 2. I tried to, but I just could never really get into it, so I came into this game pretty fresh with basically no hype. So my review perspective is of someone who's familiar with most Paradox games and someone who plays a lot of strategy games in general. So the first question people will be wondering who are new to this type of game is how easy is it to learn? And the answer is, it's still pretty difficult, at least it was for me. Crusader Kings is a grand strategy game all about characters. You'll need to kind of forget what you learned in other games about empires or nations. Instead, characters are just the driving force of everything. An example of this would be that empires cannot really ally each other. Instead, the rulers ally each other, and when one of those rulers dies, the alliance dies with them. When waging a war, you typically do so for a character's right to take something, their claim to it. If they die, or they leave your empire, you don't get to fight for that claim anymore. This might sound really basic or normal for players of Crusader Kings, but for me, having played Europa Universalis, Imperator, Stellaris, Total War, there's always been the idea of the Empire. The Empire does something and that continues on, regardless of who is ruling it. So this was just something that was constantly a hurdle for me to get over, and because the game is character driven, there's a lot of abstract ideas and concepts to represent a character and their family. The following words I'm going to say are all resources or a form of progression that a character has. None of these are the same thing, though some of them are linked. You have prestige, fame, renown, splendor, dread, prowess, stress, piety, devotion. You live within your realm. You have holdings as part of your domain. Holdings are baronies, which can be cities, castles, or temples. These belong to counties, which belong to duchies, which belong to kingdoms, which can reside within empires. Oh, and some of these names will change based on where you are in the world. A county is called an earldom in England, replacing the title of count with earl. That's just the things your character interacts with, but there's also the game's overarching concepts, such as religious fervor, cultural fascination, territory control, territory development, vassals, hooks, schemes, guardians, wards, knights, mercenaries, holy orders, claims, de jure claims, holy wars. The list goes on. So is it easy to learn? No, it's not easy, but it's certainly manageable thanks to the tutorial, the frequent advisor pop-ups, the suggestions page, and the inclusion of a pretty robust encyclopedia, not to mention the nested tooltips which now let you kind of figure out the game concepts when you see something you're unsure about. While you're never really shown how to play or why you would do something, you can typically find any information you need to pretty quickly, and because of that, it's probably the most user-friendly Paradox game there is. Another thing I kind of struggled with in the beginning is finding the motivation to do anything. I guess I'm pretty dead inside. You're not given any goals or objectives, the game is one large open sandbox, and it's really up to you to make your own fun. Ultimately, the game is about ensuring your dynasty, playing as a strong and high-skilled ruler, and if you want, expanding in order to create titles, unifying different places under one name. You can also go after the different decisions or try to get achievements. The decisions are probably the best place to start if you're looking for a goal. They're sort of like cultural objectives. As Bohemia, you could have the decision to unite the Slavs, a huge undertaking which would see you merging several large kingdoms together. As Denmark, you have the option to restore the Danelaw, seizing much of England and destroying the kingdom in the process. These things help give meaning to your campaigns. There's also 2 start dates and several rulers with their history and challenges already outlined. So you can kind of step into a more established role, or you could just wing it and play as anyone you want, except for the republics or theocratic governments like the Papal States. So that's sort of the new player portion of the review. It's a steep learning curve, but it's manageable, and you can still have fun while uncovering mechanics and learning as you go. I often see people saying they don't want to play a Paradox game because they just seem too complex. But what I often don't see or hear is that you can just totally wing it, enjoy things as they come at you, and learn from your mistakes. It's fun doing that, especially in this game because your character's life can be so unique that when you restart the campaign, even as the same person, it's highly unlikely that things will ever play out the same way. So let's delve a little deeper now into the characters themselves. Seeing as they are the main focus of the game, there's a lot to discuss with them. In Crusader Kings 3, you play as one character, and you typically live out their life until death, though there are some cases where you can switch to another character without dying, but that can be somewhat rare. As characters grow up, they obtain 3 personality traits that define who they are. Each of these traits has an opposing trait. For instance, a generous person cannot be a greedy person, and they'll dislike greedy people as well. These traits will shape many of the events and interactions the character has throughout their life, giving them certain options based on who they are. Now, making decisions that don't align with these personality traits will cause them to take on stress, and accumulating too much stress will cause mental breaks where your character will weaken and may become reliant on something, and if the stress isn't reduced, it could even lead to death. This is a brilliant way to force some roleplay without being too restrictive, and it's a great way to punish players who don't pay attention and end up getting a bad character on the throne. In my playthrough, I set up some claims in such a way that my grandson would inherit both the Kingdom of England and Denmark, but all my eggs were in one basket. And the young King Harald wasn't exactly fit for the role. He was shy and also lazy. And I know what that's like. And this meant he didn't deal well with others, so when swaying other people's opinion, he took stress. And because he was lazy, organizing events to reduce that stress just didn't work. So now I had a character where 2 options I was very familiar with using were almost useless to me. And on top of that, Harald's 3rd trait was lustful, which meant he could go to a brothel to reduce his stress, but he would obviously run the risk of some disease, or possibly children, with claims to England. So because of this, Harald became a reclusive king who executed prisoners in order to make people fear him rather than develop relationships. Ultimately, he was taken prisoner in one of many wars against his tyranny because some of his powerful vassals were brave enough that they weren't intimidated by his fear tactics. That's a great example of how these base personality traits can create some really interesting and unique gameplay. Now, while there's a limit on your personality traits, there's no limit on all the other things you can accumulate over a character's life. There's congenital traits that pass down from your parents, lifestyle traits you can obtain by leveling up, coping mechanism traits for dealing with stress, criminal traits, health traits, and active diseases. Over a character's lifetime, they'll accumulate quite the variety of these and really create a unique story. Most of these traits define a character's skill set: diplomacy, martial, stewardship, intrigue, learning, and prowess. As a ruler, these skills tie into several aspects of your entire realm, granting a modifier to opinion, army size, taxes, schemes, innovations, and piety. For other characters in your realm, you're going to want to hire them to directly improve your council or armies based on these skills, but you'll also want to hire people who desire the position based on their rank or power. It's these little choices that can have big impact. You'll often have to decide between someone's skill or their loyalty. But with diligent forward planning, the people you put in power will also be skilled, if only it were that easy. The skills bring me to a somewhat controversial area of the game, the skill tree, also known as lifestyle perks. Based on the education trait of a character, that's the trait they get when they become an adult, they'll be suited to adopting a lifestyle they have a background in. So if they have a diplomatic education, then the diplomacy lifestyle will progress faster. You're free to invest into whatever you want though, and you can even reset all the perks once in your lifetime if you can handle the stress. While progressing through the chains does feel rewarding, it's also an area of the game I feel becomes repetitive really quickly. I think generally this is because there's only 15 chains in total, so your characters can end up doing the same thing and become the same types of people, at least for their lifestyle. In theory, you could gain traits like the torturer trait without ever torturing someone, the seducer trait without ever seducing, and things of this nature. It wouldn't really be an optimal thing to do, but I do think it's weird that it's even possible. And it's one of the only areas in the game that largely just disregards who your character is in terms of their established personality traits. I'd definitely like to see this expanded and also play off your existing personality just a bit more. Someone who has the deceitful trait could maybe progress through schemer at a faster rate, or even have a unique perk in there available because they're already deceitful. This would give you more reason to play to your character's strength rather than just take the perk that you need that allows you to do that thing you've wanted to do. The last thing I want to touch on with characters is schemes. Now, schemes are essentially interactions that characters can develop over time. They can be either hostile or personal. Now, a hostile scheme is carried out in secret with the aid of your spy master's intrigue skill. There's actually not that much you can do. You can murder, abduct, fabricate hook, and claim throne. Those are all the hostile schemes, and murder is the only one that isn't tied to a lifestyle perk. This aspect of the game just feels really lacking to me. I think the mechanics in place are cool. You know, you begin a murder scheme, you can blackmail people close to the target to get them in on the plot. That increases your chances, and then events can happen along the way to change the outcome. That's all great. But there's only like 4, maybe 5 murder plots, so you'll see repetition really quickly, certainly even within one character's lifetime, let alone one playthrough. And only having 4 possible hostile schemes just seems really bare bones. I'm not sure why there isn't more, like attempting to intimidate someone, bribe them, steal from them, spread rumors to turn characters against each other. Stuff like that I feel like would have expanded the intrigue aspect of the game quite a lot. On the personal scheme side of things, these are schemes that you can carry out by yourself, without the need of a spy master. And there's 5 of these, that largely all just improve the opinion of other characters in different ways, such as becoming friends or lovers. There seems to be a bit of an issue in the game with this happening way too often, where characters that are considered soulmates still regularly cheat on one another because of someone else seducing them. Not to say that this couldn't happen, but it does happen in CK3 extremely frequently. I've probably played with maybe 10 rulers, and 7 of them had their spouses cheat and father illegitimate children. A pretty interesting aspect of the game that's sort of tied to the schemes is the secrets and hooks. Now, some characters can get up to pretty nefarious things, and if you can learn about those things, you can blackmail them into getting a hook. Now, a hook can be weak or strong, and it can be then used in several circumstances to get your way. For instance, if you have a hook on one of your vassals, you can modify their contract so that they have to give you more money or troops. Or, if you have a voting system for elections, you can use a hook on someone to get them to vote the same way as you. There's really a lot of different ways to use them, and if you get a strong hook on a vassal, it's actually often better to keep it to yourself, as they'll never rebel against you in fear that you might expose their secret. However, other characters can expose their secret too, and if the secret's out, you lose your hook. It also works both ways. People can learn about your secrets and call in that favor to get their way at your expense. I think it's a really fun part of the game, and of course, characters have some pretty weird secrets, like being a witch or a cannibal, so it can be really fun discovering what your supposed friends really get up to. So that's it for the characters in the game. There's obviously even more you could go into with them, but to sum it up, they are really quite unique. And it should also be mentioned that they look really good. They age visibly over time, they have a different posture depending on their traits, their diseases are even visible, as are their wounds in battle. And because of this level of detail, it's certainly very easy to get attached to characters. And while I do wish They could interact with each other in more substantial ways. Generally speaking, there's still a lot there with the 30+ personality traits opening up decisions and new events. For example, when you see that your character becomes depressed, you actually get the option to commit suicide. It's touches like that really make you feel like you're playing as them. So let's shift gears away from the personal and move to the political. Crusader Kings 3's territories are organized into a non-rigid hierarchy of nested vassals, and what that essentially means is that from the bottom up you have the mayor of a city, who is the vassal of a count, who's the vassal of a duke, who's the vassal of a king, who's the vassal of an emperor. And that's the natural order of things, but it's non-rigid. You can have gaps in that chain. Now, each of these ranks are tied to a title. A title is the ownership over something, be it territory directly or other vassals. So for instance, King Harold of England has the title for being the King of England. There can only be one King of England. Many people can have the claim to it, but there can only actually be one who holds the title. That's the same for every title in the game, whether it be a small county or a large empire. And this is also non-rigid, and it's where the game starts to get really messy. A character can hold multiple titles of different ranks at the same time. So you could be the King of England, but also the Earl of Oxfordshire. And this would be an example of where the king has broken the natural order of things so that he could hold land directly. In the normal structure, the Earl of Oxfordshire would be a vassal under a duke, and that vassal would be under the king. At each step, the vassal is paying a percentage of their gold and their available troops up the chain, which allows rulers to scrape small amounts of income and troops from everyone below them. When the natural order is broken, these rulers become upset that they've been bypassed. If you were a duke and you were ruling over 4 counties that were supposed to be paying you, but they were instead just paying the king directly, you'd be pretty annoyed because you're not getting your cut along the way and you're still paying the king. This is tracked as a de jure problem.
De jure.
When I said things got messy before, now they're going to get sloppy. So the map of Crusader Kings 3 has map modes for de jure duchies, de jure kingdoms, and de jure empires. Just by the way, FYI, that word can go fuck off.
De jure.
De jure.
De jure.
Each of these are essentially hypothetical maps. They don't represent where things are, but where they would like to be. Much of what you do on an administration level is try to organize things so they fit in their rightful place. You do this because otherwise people are going to get upset that the natural order of where things should be is broken. When they get upset, they actually might just fight to fix the problem themselves or resort to some sort of intrigue. So what makes this super interesting is that you could be the ruler of a big complex network like the Holy Roman Empire, and your vassals can fight each other to realign their own borders. Now you can ask them to stop, but they don't have to if they don't want to. If you decide to play as one of those vassals, you're fighting to grow your own domain within a big secure alliance. It's actually super interesting. I'm not sure I've really experienced that type of gameplay before. Now, of course, it's not all about fighting. You could do some intrigue, marry the right people, work your way up in different ways if you want. You might be thinking, well, what's the point of a vassal if you have no control over who it attacks and what it does? Well, as you gain prestige, you can increase your crown authority, which gives you more power over your vassals. There's 4 levels to this, and as you build crown authority, you erode the autonomy of your vassals. They'll like you much less for it, and they may even attempt a rebellion if you can't keep them in line, but if you can manage it, you'll get much more money and control over what they do. One of the things that makes this so interesting and brilliant, really, and enjoyable to play, is that the game scales with you without leaving any features behind. Often in strategy games, as you grow in size, you either have more micromanagement to deal with, or you're given less control. In CK3, a duke has to manage their vassals the same way a king does, but it's non-rigid. If you want to rule over 30 vassals directly, you can do that, but it's going to be hard to keep track of, so you can work to create that natural order power structure I mentioned, and this way fewer people answer to you, which means fewer people to keep happy and manage. I really don't think it can be understated that the game works on this many levels. You can play as a lowly count building up their county, to a large emperor who builds things in the same way. That's a really good design, and others should look to copy the principal ideas behind this scalability. It largely solves the issue of having your game suddenly become boring or tedious because you grew a bit bigger. That's not to say that the game is immune from a snowball effect. It's not. As you grow larger and as technology progresses, things do become easier, though I've noticed that it's down to the ruler and just the passing of time, especially technology, more than anything. If you've got a good ruler, strong authority, and your vassals like you, then it can be quite easy to ignore internal management and put all your resources into becoming even more powerful, at least during that person's lifetime. Now, I'm not sure how they can address this other than having more competent AI. Strong alliances that can rival your own would make late game wars more interesting, but as it stands, most large empires I've seen fracture into several pieces or run so heavily in debt that they can be defeated rather easily. So to work back briefly to why you would be both a king and an earl at the same time, it's because while you do get a percentage income and troops from vassals, it's not going to be enough, especially if they're the ones who are going to rise up against you. You need your own direct holdings to get the full bulk of troops and income, so while you might be a king or queen of a large area, you'll also want your own counties to rule over just to be safe. This is where the building system comes in. The building system in the game is both straightforward and also quite deep. All the buildings give you positives, and in this way they kind of feel like improvements. And depending on the terrain of where you're building, you get different options. For a forest, you can build logging camps and forest forts. Coastal, you can build trade ports and things like that. And these can all be upgraded to provide more taxes and levies and also improve your development. Now, development of a county is a really important stat. It essentially determines the tax rate, the levies, and the supply of the area, while also improving your overall research rate. The earlier you can invest into development, the better off you'll be in the long run. There's also special duchy capital buildings that have strong improvements. I'm particularly a fan of the leisure palaces. That's right, that reduce stress, increase prestige, and increase scheme success chance. These are big, expensive projects that take years to build. On top of this, there's also historical, unique buildings located around the world, some that can be built or just improved, such as the Tower of London or the Canterbury Cathedral, and some that are just constants, such as Stonehenge. These unique location-specific buildings affect your entire realm, so they're really powerful, and there's about 40 of them, I think, in total. You can also build the baronies themselves. These can be cities, castles, or temples. Now, you can never rule the cities or temples directly. Instead, these are run by mayors and bishops. Mayors are your vassals. Bishops answer to your archbishop, who gives you back some money if he likes you. The reason that you'd create cities and temples is so that they'll build in them for you with their own money, and buildings are expensive, so this is a good way to plan a cheaper future that generates passive income. You also, to an extent, have to give out certain amounts of temples and cities. Temples will also give you a bulk amount of piety when they're constructed, so that's pretty good too. For a really large time, I just ignored buildings in the game because I had this mental block when I see that, if you spend 150 gold, you'll earn 0.2 gold per month, which by my math would mean something like 62 years before the building would even just pay itself off. But the reality of that is that these numbers are modified. Not by much, but they are modified by your development and your stewardship to raise your overall tax level. And as with all Paradox map games really, it's based on economies of scale and improvements over time. While I prefer more traditional empire builders, I've kind of come to appreciate the slow burn of investing into territories and really feeling the substantial effects at least a few decades later. It's not that rewarding to do immediately, but if you lose something, it's very painful, so I guess that does mean it is worthwhile. So let's move on now to warfare. Wars in Crusader Kings 3 are pretty straightforward in general. Typically a war is waged for some sort of claim to land where you're basically saying, hey, I'm the rightful owner of this land and I'm fighting for it. In these wars, the defender can never gain territory, but if they win, they typically gain money and fame. Now the war ends when the war score reaches 100% or negative 100%, and the score goes up when you win battles and take territories. Now if you capture the war leader, you can also enforce demands as well, so there's a sort of an ace in the hole kind of thing going on. I've found wars to be really quite interesting the more I play with them. Not perfect, but generally quite interesting. The enemy AI is actually really great at coordinating their troops together, keeping them spaced apart but near enough to each other so they can reinforce, and targeting vulnerable armies to catch them on their own, or rushing your capital. They're a little bit capital crazy, I'd say. It's quite predictable. They really do rush it pretty much as soon as they can, and I suppose it makes sense as it is more valuable for war score, and they might also capture you as the ruler or your family members there. So I can kind of, it's not really the AI's fault, it's pretty obvious that that's where they're going to go. The ally AI, on the other hand, is way more frustrating because they tend to have their own plan, and they often just avoid linking up with your troops. They'll often just stay right next to your troops in a big battle and just stand there watching it. It's really sadistic almost that they want to watch you die. There really needs to be a kind of a rally point or a coordinate attack button to help let the AI know what you're planning, because often they just do not back you up. Now, in order to talk about how the battles work, we kind of need to understand what makes up an army. The bulk of an army is levies raised across your realm. Then you'll have specific units called men-at-arms that you can create, and these specialize in specific unit types and also have culture-unique units like Huskarls for the Danes. These men-at-arms all excel at destroying levies, but all have different counters to each other. So the complexity emerges from having spears beating cavalry, archers beating spears, and so on. There's plenty of depth to be had there, and there's also then the knights. Knights are regular characters in your realm, often vassals, that can be quite powerful and raise the overall quality of the army. However, they die in battle pretty often, or at least get wounded. So you need to be really careful with who you place into an army, as they might be important vassals and could end up destabilizing their region if they die. I actually feel like the Knights system is something that makes battles really quite important. You can gain back levies and men-at-arms pretty quickly over time. There's no real repercussion to losing them in battle. But losing Knights is significant, as you can't just create more. And depending on who the Knights are, be it vassals, family members, it's a real blow to lose them. So I think it's a really great way to bring in that kind of character-focused nature to the battles themselves. Terrain and supply also play a role. Every region in the game has terrain types and also a supply limit. Supply gains if you're in a region where your troop count is under the supply limit. It's basically an anti-blobbing mechanic to get you to kind of divide up your armies a bit. Now, when it comes to battle, all of these things are considered. The terrain affects units differently on an individual basis, with cavalry performing better in plains rather than the wetlands, for example. Defenders will do better on hills and mountains, and river crossings punish attackers. If supply is low, your army performs worse. The skill of the commander, the amount of levies, the men-at-arms counters, and the knights all contribute to the battle calculations each time, with a dice roll for a bit of RNG. There's also different phases to battle, where in the early phases units are mostly routed, and in the final phase they're chased down and killed. If you can overwhelm the enemy and do enough damage in those early phases, you might end up just wiping the army completely before they ever get away. I really enjoy the battle system in this game. I think it's got just the right amount of depth for a game like this, and combined with the war score, you can have some real campaign-defining battles. Like, for instance, I had this battle as the newly crowned King of England, I was also the King of Denmark, against another claimant for the King of England, Roger. Throughout the war, Roger had beaten us down pretty badly numerous times, and we were in a pretty tough spot. I'd managed to get some mercenaries, and we threw everything we had into a big pitched battle at Buckingham. Because the war score was bad, it meant that if we lost this particular battle, that would have been it, and Roger would have been the King of England, and I would have lost half my empire. If we won the battle, the war score would have bought me more time, but I think I was about to run out of money anyway, so things were just looking really bleak. What ended up happening is, as the battle raged on, we had just about won that main phase and began the chase phase, and Roger was killed, and the entire war became invalid because his claim died with him. Only 3 knights died, but he happened to be one of them, and this gave me enough time to restore the Danelaw, which destroyed all the titles to the Kingdom of England, so nobody could ever claim the throne again. It was really against all odds, and it was such a great moment. And someone at the time asked me about Total War battles while I was streaming it, and I said that even though I didn't fight the battle manually, what was at stake in that battle was greater than any Total War battle I've ever had. Like, I've never had a game of Total War where one battle could decide the fate of an empire before. It was really, really great. You forget, if you're a Total War fan, you forget that you're not fighting the battles, because you can get very immersed in them nevertheless. The biggest issue for me with wars is the rally point system and moving by sea. When it comes to rally points, you can raise your entire army in one location in the space of about 1 month, which is just super fast. I feel like armies should at least be raised from their empire de jure, meaning that if you raise an army in London, it'll pull all the troops from the Britannia de jure. But right now, raising an army in London for me means that it'll pull all the troops I have from England, France, Estonia, and Denmark all at once, and it's really fast and it doesn't cost anything. Now, it's not just for added realism, it's just a bit easy. I feel like the bigger you are, the longer this should have to take, as you're already at an advantage typically. The other thing is that moving by sea is super fast, and you'll see armies just hopping out to sea and dropping back onto land all over the place almost randomly. They suffer a 30-day disembarkment penalty to battle, which is actually pretty severe, and it costs more to travel at sea, but it just still seems so quick and easy. I think you should need to have a large amount of supply before you can even get on the ships, or it should just take way longer to get on them, so that you can actually catch armies before they do this. This is just one area I think that definitely needs work, but overall, I've enjoyed battles and wars really quite a lot. Now, there's not much more to it, but Crusades operate kind of similar. I feel like we should talk about Crusades, given the name of the game. There's a war goal decided by the Pope, a bunch of people agree to join in, and a big war chest gets divided between everyone to carry out the crusade. It's pretty fun, and it's quite a good incentive to get you to do it, and it can lead to some really big conflicts, but it's also just kind of pretty easy. Whoever contributes the most to the crusade gets to decide who in their family takes the throne of the new territories. I had my daughter become the Queen of Syria after I just fought one battle, and it wasn't even the biggest one I'd seen for that conflict, so I don't know how it happened. Annoyingly, once she did become the queen, she was so far from Denmark that I actually wasn't allowed to talk to her anymore because of diplomatic range. I actually had the option to play as her though, which is kind of cool as well. Anyway, without allies, she lost it all within a year, and the only way I could get her back home was marrying her to some random knight to get her to come home. But her kids were still stuck out at Aleppo, and she was even still their guardian, but they were just kind of left behind. So it feels like it might need some work, maybe, or it's just kind of an oversight, I don't know. Anyway, Crusades lead me nicely to faith and religion. This is one area of the game I had quite little experience with so far. In some ways, it seems to have a lot of depth, but in others, it seems to be really simple. In terms of depth, you can create your own faith with a list of over 30 tenets that it can follow that make it truly unique. Then you can determine what religious doctrines it has, so you can effectively change religious law, and this is what people live by. So for instance, you can allow same-sex relationships, or you can tolerate witchcraft. Adversely, you could not allow that, and that means you're allowed to punish people with that without real repercussion. In terms of simplicity, spreading religion seems really basic. You essentially just tell your archbishop to convert a county, and if you have a particularly high-skilled bishop, it'll only take a couple of years. Then the territory will just flip. For people, they'll often just convert if you demand that they do, or if you get a hook on them. Culture is handled in a pretty similar way, with territories flipping over time quite easily. I'm not really sure what more I would want, but religion and culture seems really ignorable and passive in the campaigns I played. Maybe some buildings should need to be built to make it speed up or something like that, I don't know. I mean, I was able to use it to my advantage, and it is quite powerful, especially religion, like winning crusades and holy wars, being religious, reaching the maximum level of piety, or devotion or whatever, makes everyone of the same religion really like you a lot. So it's certainly useful, but it's, again, just a bit passive. The very last thing to touch on for me is the UI. Now this is a point of contention for a lot of people, but I kind of break it down into 3 different categories. The UI, in terms of its clarity, in terms of being able to find and read things easily, is probably like an 8 or 9 out of 10 for me. It's very, very easy. In terms of style, it's probably about a 5. There are some hints of medieval flair here and there with stained glass buttons, some scrolls, some stone, but generally it is a bit bland. It doesn't really feel that medieval. In terms of raw functionality, I'd say it's probably a 7. More map modes would be great, as would some sort of event log for the things that you may miss. You know, often notices will flash in your face and then go away, and you might not have been looking at it for a moment, and then it's gone. But overall, I think having an encyclopedia, having nested tooltips, all of that stuff is wonderful for learning concepts and ideas, even if they aren't always explained how they work. I actually did an entire video talking about the UI before, because I'm a pretty cool dude, you know, and if there's something that gets the girls sweaty down below, it's talking about some hot tooltips. Oh yeah. Anyway, go check that out if you're interested. Alright, so that is it for my in-depth review of Crusader Kings 3. Of course, there's even more I could have looked at in the game, but in the interest of time, I think this is enough of a deep dive into what makes the game really great, which I believe it is. I think it's a great game. And furthermore, there's also mods out for the game that shake up some of these ideas too. There's the Bronze Age overhaul and the Prince of Darkness overhaul, which I think are definitely worth checking out. It's really great to see such a strong offering from modders so early into the game's life, and that Paradox have really supported them. Now, in summary, I think this is a really approachable Paradox game thanks to its UI and increased art budget. I think it's really deep in terms of the different ways that you can play and how unique each campaign can feel. I think it's clever in how it scales up or down based on your ruler's rank, never really overwhelming you unless you've chosen to kind of take on a burden for yourself. It has some areas that are kind of minor annoyances or simplifications, but overall, I think it's a really great game. And I haven't even tried multiplayer or really gone and done a deep dive on different cultures and religions. I haven't messed with mods, so there's a huge amount of content on offer still to check out for me. Unfortunately, there is a bit of a black spot on my time with the game, and I have to mention it because I played with Iron Man turned on, and also cloud saves were on by default. I didn't really mean to, it's just the way the game was kind of set up in the beginning, and I thought, yeah, why not? I just thought, why not? My save has basically stopped saving, so my campaign is sort of ruined. Every time I play it, I get reset back again to where it was before, which is really disappointing to me, and I play in a really immersive fashion. I don't want to do it again and have a different timeline than what I did, so it's kind of over for me in that regard. So make sure if you play the game, you don't use cloud saves and probably just stay away from Iron Man for a while. Alright, so that is it for the review. If you're interested in getting the game, there is a CD keys link in the description below, which helps me out. A bunch of people got it after my Prince Nud of Denmark video, so big thank you to them. It's on a big discount, so check it out. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.